Alrighty, this is really interesting. If you can see these letters, they're from the White House, and they are written and signed by Franklin Roosevelt. And this letter was written to my grandfather, Mr. Walter Burke. Now, I say this in a laudatory way, not in a self-congratulatory way, but it's just the truth about my grandfather. He was arguably the most admired attorney in the history of Louisiana. That is a fact. He was such a genteel, gentle, kind man, but of enormous integrity, as well as charity toward others. But he was one of the few people who would testify against Huey Long. Huey Long was a dictator. In fact, he is the antecedent. He and George Wallace and Joseph McCarthy of the gentleman that happens to be in the White House today. But it's an enormous difference in, anyway, the ethos of, I think, those times, the era of Roosevelt, and the times in which we live today. I didn't mean to get off on all that. But anyway, this was a letter written by the president to my grandfather. My grandfather was an appointee of Franklin Roosevelt. This was written to my great uncle, my grandfather's brother. And I think when this was written by Roosevelt, December 5th, which is my birthday. I didn't even notice that, 1924. And it's really interesting what Roosevelt said about the Democratic Party back then. He said, in effect, the Democratic Party was chaotic. Well, nothing has changed. Anyway, my grandfather testified against Huey Long at Huey Long's impeachment hearing. Few people had the courage to do that. The night before the hearing, Huey Long sent the state police to the homes of the witnesses against him to intimidate them, but he didn't do it to my grandfather. No, sir, he did not. But anyway, this is some of my family up here, if you can make out these pictures. That was my father when he was a little bitty boy. And that's my great-grandfather, again, who was with Stonewall Jackson. That was my Uncle Brown. He was a member of my mother's brother. He was in the invasion of the Philippines in World War II. And this is my mother here, this little girl here. And that was her brother. And that's her brother, too. And, oh, that's a postcard. I think it was written in 1942. My dad and I had ridden the train. It was right after Pearl Harbor. We'd ridden a train from Houston to New Iberia. And I remember the ride, because there were no seats. I sat on top of a suitcase. And the whole train was full of soldiers, just packed from one end. People with men in uniform. But anyway, the era in which I was born was a very different one from the one in which we live today. And it was a great time to grow up. And it might just seem like nostalgia, but the world in which I did grow up was quite different from the one in which we live today. And here's the difference, that we were one nation, we were one people. And we knew that in effect the human race was at a critical juncture. And we united together, we put aside our differences, and eventually democracy prevailed in the Western world. But I believe we live in a time now when it's threatened once again. I didn't think that time would come again. But I think it's here. The forces of demagoguery, the voices of hate and anger and divisiveness are with us. And there is a coterie of men who wish to once again inculcate fear and suspicion and distrust of our institutions. They want to inculcate in that in us to divide us against ourselves, and they're very good at it. And I have great trepidation about where we're going now. I think our planet is at risk. And what is most unfortunate is that, as William Butler Yeats once said, we live in a time in which the best of people lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with passionate intensity. He wrote that, 1920, 1915? And of course, he was talking about the neo-colonialism that brought about World War I. We're still there. The issues have not changed, except those who are the harbingers of demagoguery, dictatorships, and war are far more sophisticated in their methodology.